So have you seen those headlines going around recently?
About the workplace chemicals and autism. Yeah, I have.
Exactly. Linking parental exposure, chemical exposure at work to worse autism in their kids. A UC Davis health press release really made a splash.
It definitely sparked a lot of conversation and maybe some confusion, too, I think.
For sure. And that's what we're doing a deep dive on today. You, our listener, actually sent over both the original study.
And a really fascinating critical take on it.
Right. So our mission today is basically to unpack these, to get past the headline.
Yeah, beyond the initial claims.
And really understand what the research actually says.
Yeah.
And maybe just as crucial, what it doesn't say.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating here, I think, is just how one headline can end up hiding a much, much more complex story, especially with sensitive topics like autism.
Definitely.
So this dive is really, it's an exercise in critical thinking, isn't it? Looking past the surface.
It really is. It shows why it's so important to look into the details, the methodology.
Peeling back the layers.
Okay, so let's start with what that UC Davis health press release was really shouting about.
The main claim.
Yeah, the main claim. It said the study was one of the first to connect parental job exposures to the severity of their child's autism using the ADOS-2.
Right, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it sort of painted plastics and phenols as these villains, leading to cognitive deficits, behavioral issues, basically more severe autism. The whole way it was framed, it presented autism almost like a harm to be measured.
Like something you tally up. Yeah, its weight increasing, with each hazard.
Precisely. But then we look at the critical analysis you sent.
And this is where it gets interesting because the source points out what the press release doesn't mention.
What it carefully avoids, yeah.
Right. There are some pretty big caveats buried in the actual paper.
Like what?
Well, for starters, the exposures weren't actually measured. They were just kind of guessed at based on job histories.
Guessed. Wow, okay.
Yeah. And the sample size, the group they studied, was pretty narrow. But maybe the most crucial thing.
Go on.
The results actually ran in both directions.
Both directions, meaning?
Meaning some chemicals they looked at were actually linked with improved skills in the kids or reduced behavioral issues.
Seriously? So the opposite of the headline claim.
Exactly. But that nuance, that complexity, it just got, the critique says it was replaced by neatness, making autism severity seem really clear-cut when the data wasn't.
Okay, that's a huge point. Let's dig into that sample population then. Who were these kids and families?
Yeah, the demographics really stand out when you look closely.
How so?
Well, get this, 86% of the kids were boys.
86%.
And nearly 80% were white or Hispanic. Same for the parents, overwhelmingly white or Hispanic, mostly in their early 30s. Typical education was some college. And importantly, these families were already plugged into California's regional center system.
Which implies?
It implies they already had a certain level of, let's call it institutional capital. They knew how to navigate the system, get diagnoses, access services.
So a very specific group. Not necessarily representative of everyone.
Not at all. And the critique raises this really important question, from a critical theory angle. What happens when your typical autistic subject in research is basically a white boy in California from a family with these resources?
And then those findings get treated as universal.
Exactly. It's what the critique calls silently universalized. This kind of study design just effectively erases, or at least sidelines, autistic girls and women, Black autistics, indigenous autistics, working class families, people who don't speak English. And then the results are presented like they apply to everyone with autism.
So it's not just a narrow sample, it's potentially baking in a bias right from the start. Does the critique talk about why this keeps happening? Maybe funding?
It absolutely does. It connects it directly to funding structures. The UC Davis Mind Institute, where this study happened, gets a lot of federal money through the Autism Cares Act. We're talking billions for autism research over the years. And what often gets funded, according to the analysis, is research that uses the most accessible and institutionally convenient populations.
Makes sense from a practical standpoint, I guess.
But the result is that these convenient groups, often white, often male, often middle class, become the default image of autism. Their specific traits and challenges are then projected onto all autistic people.
So whiteness and maleness kind of get baked in as the standard for autism itself.
That's what the critique argues. It says the severe phenotype, the characteristics deemed severe, is often already coded male and white before they even run the numbers.
That's quite a claim. And it leads us to the tools they used, right?
Yeah.
The ADOS, ABC, MSEL, VBS. The critique had issues with those too.
Big issues. The core argument is that they all share this fundamental conceptual flaw.
Which is,
They all measure autism against a neurotypical benchmark. They start from the idea that neurotypical development is the norm, the default.
right?
So autism isn't really assessed as just a different way of being, but as a series of deviations or deficits from that norm.
And that distance is a severity score.
Essentially, yes. That distance gets quantified and labeled severity. Take the ADOS, often called the gold standard for diagnosis. The critique says it basically turns social differences, like how someone makes eye contact or engages in conversation, into points on a severity scale.
So the more you differ from typical social expectations.
The more severe your autism is deemed. The critique calls it circular reasoning.
Yeah.
Autism is defined by deviating from the norm, so the more you deviate, the more severe you are.
Okay, I see the loop there. What about the others, like the ABC?
The aberrant behavior checklist, yeah.
Yeah.
That one was developed for institutional settings, and it pathologizes things it calls aberrant behaviors, like hyperactivity, irritability, inappropriate speech. But the critique points out that these can include autistic ways of regulating stimming, scripting, even withdrawal. These are counted as symptoms, not adaptations.
So coping mechanisms become problems to be measured.
Pretty much. Then you have the MSEL, the Mullen scales of early learning. That measures cognitive development against typical timelines. So autistic patterns like learning language in chunks, gestalt processing, or developing skills at different paces get coded as deficits because they don't follow the standard sequence.
Right, and the VABS.
The Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales, that looks at adaptive functioning daily living skills. But again, it's measured against age-based norms derived from neurotypical development.
Okay.
And the critique argues it penalizes anyone who doesn't fit this mold of an imagined, independent, self-sufficient individual, kind of flattening the diverse ways autistic people relate and function into just a list of deficits.
So putting it all together, these tools, they're not really measuring if autism can be made worse.
Not according to this critique. Because, it argues, autism isn't an illness to get worse or better. These tools are measuring how far a specific child diverges from a very specific set of expectations.
Expectations based on a neurotypical, individualistic viewpoint.
Exactly. A compliance-oriented society's expectations. So, concluding that chemical exposures increase severity is described as a sleight of hand.
That's so.
Because all it's really showing is an increased distance from that neurotypical baseline, which the tools themselves define as problematic. The measurement itself kind of reinforces the pathologizing frame.
Wow. Okay, but here's the part that I found honestly pretty shocking, and the critique really hammers this home. Despite the headlines, the study's own data showed contradictions, right?
Huge contradictions. It's actually kind of astounding when you dig into it. For all the noise about chemicals worsening autism,
Yeah?
some of the strongest results they found went in the opposite direction.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, so the source pulls these right from the study's tables. Pesticide exposure in fathers was linked with better adaptive and social skills in their kids.
Better skills?
Yes. And mothers using certain pharmaceuticals, tied to improved language in the children.
Improves language.
And maybe the most dramatic one, phenol exposure in fathers was linked to a massive boost, like 2.5 standard deviations in visual reception skills.
Whoa. That's not subtle. So what did the researchers do with these findings?
They basically dismiss them. The critique points out they slapped on this dismissive label opposite to hypothesis and buried them, often just in supplementary data files.
So, oops, doesn't fit our theory, let's hide it.
That's certainly the interpretation in the critique. It says, pretty bluntly, this is not science so much as propaganda dressed up in regression tables.
Strong words.
Yeah, because, it argues, a genuinely curious scientific approach would pause there. It would ask, why are we seeing these results? What could explain this?
Instead of just brushing it aside because it didn't fit the narrative they expected or wanted.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this ties into what the analysis calls big autism.
Big autism, what do they mean by that?
It's described as this whole interconnected system, funding agencies, research institutions, journals, PR departments,
Okay.
that all kind of work together, maybe not intentionally conspiring, but the effect is to perpetuate this specific narrative about autism.
The narrative being.
Autism as a tragedy, a deficit, something broken that needs fixing or preventing, or something that can be made better or worse.
Right.
And in this view, the actual messy findings of a study might matter less than simply feeding that machine, providing another headline, another justification for the existing framework, another reason to fund more research within that same frame.
So inconvenient truths, like chemicals potentially correlating with better skills in some areas, just get ignored because they don't fit the story.
They're not allowed to disrupt the narrative, essentially.
Which brings us to what the critique calls the deepest flaw, this predetermined frame.
Yeah, the idea that the researchers went in assuming a simple one-way street. Parental chemical exposure equals worse autism. Full stop.
And anything that didn't fit that neat line was just noise.
Treated as noise, yeah. Or an anomaly to be explained away. And because, as we discussed, severity itself is presented as this manufactured construct,
Built on those deficit-based tools.
it creates this circular logic. Autism is framed as an injury or a problem from the get-go.
So improvements or findings going in the wrong direction, they can't compute.
They destabilize the whole premise. If autism isn't inherently harm, then the whole framework starts to wobble, so those results have to be minimized.
And what's really striking, as the critique points out, is how this focus completely makes the real concrete harms disappear.
Exactly. Things like genuinely unsafe workplaces, chemical deregulation, labor exploitation, environmental injustice.
Issues that absolutely do injure people and ecosystems. We know they cause cancer, respiratory problems, reproductive issues.
Undeniable harms. But in this study's framing, according to the critique, those real harms get refracted, twisted.
Through what the source calls a eugenic prism.
Yeah, where autism becomes the proxy for injury. It stands in for the actual damage being done by exposure or exploitation.
So instead of focusing on, say, the direct health impacts of workplace chemicals on the workers themselves,
The focus shifts to whether those chemicals might make their children more autistic. Autism becomes the symbolic injury.
that's a really concerning displacement. And then there was the point about the exposure estimates themselves.
Oh yeah, the critique calls it sheer silliness.
Silliness. Why?
Because remember, they didn't actually measure any chemicals in anyone. No blood tests, no hair samples, not even checks of the home environment.
Right, you said they just guessed from job titles.
Exactly. They mapped job titles onto these generic databases of potential occupational hazards, which the critique basically compares to, well, fortune-telling. Speculative categorization, not fine-grained toxicology.
But from those very crude guesses.
Come these sweeping claims about brain development and aberrant behaviors in children. It's a huge leap based on very shaky foundations.
Okay, so stepping back, what does all this mean for you listening right now? Why should you care about the flaws in one specific study?
Because these studies don't just stay in academic journals, they get amplified.
Right, through press releases, news headlines.
Exactly. They shape how the public thinks about autism. They influence policymakers making decisions about support and funding. They guide where research money goes.
And when the research consistently frames autistic existence as some kind of toxic injury.
It props up that whole pathologizing view we talked about. The critique argues the implicit lesson people take away is, be careful about chemical exposures, or your child might end up more autistic, more impaired, more severe.
Which the source calls
the old eugenic whisper dressed in the language of occupational health. A really stark framing.
It is. And the critique also touches on a personal level, doesn't it? About the author feeling sort of used.
Yeah, there's a powerful part about the author's own experience, feeling like their work and recognition were being inadvertently bent into propaganda by an institution pushing this kind of narrative.
Well,
it really highlights the human cost, while the spotlight shines on autism as the problem.
The real crisis, as the critique terms it, gets overlooked.
It slips from view. The fact that workers, often in marginalized communities, are exposed daily to plastics, solvents, pesticides, anesthetic gases, things known to cause serious diseases, reproductive harm, shortened lives.
Weak regulations, corporate corner cutting.
All of that. But instead of tackling those issues head on, the narrative gets shifted. Autism becomes the canary in the coal mine.
While the actual miners, the workers themselves, are left exposed.
That's the analogy used. The critique argues the cost of leaving this dominant frame unchallenged isn't abstract. It's paid by autistic people, it's paid by workers, it's paid by communities whose real harms get erased in the name of studying autism's severity.
So let's try to bring this all together then. What's the main takeaway from this deep dive?
Well, looking through the lens of this critical analysis, the UC Davis study emerges as kind of a case study in bias.
Bias built on.
On narrow sampling that specific group of kids in California, on using deficit-based metrics that define autism as deviation, on cherry-picking the data, highlighting results that fit the hypothesis and downplaying those that don't.
And conclusions that seem like they were maybe decided before the research even started.
That's the argument. So what the study really teaches us, according to the critique, might be less about autism itself.
And more
More about how these research economies, this whole system, can end up just recycling the same old story. Autism equals harm. Autistic people are just evidence of injury.
while the real structural problems like exploitation and environmental hazards get quietly excused or ignored.
Yeah. And look, the final point the critique makes is crucial. Workplace safety absolutely matters. Chemical regulation matters.
But not because they might prevent autism or make it less severe.
Exactly. It matters because workers deserve not to be poisoned on the job. It matters because communities deserve clean air and water. Because our ecosystems shouldn't be treated as dumping grounds.
There's a deep irony there, isn't
A
there?
profound irony. The critique concludes by pointing out how our autistic existence is effectively being used as a kind of shield, diverting attention and accountability from those very real environmental and occupational harms.
That is definitely a provocative thought to end on. It really underscores the importance, for you listening, to keep seeking out different perspectives, different analyses.
And to question things, even when they come wrapped in official-sounding language or from respected institutions.
Keep digging behind those headlines. There's often a much deeper story there.